There is a moment, caught on a remote camera trap somewhere in the dry savanna of southern Africa, that stops wildlife researchers cold the first time they see it. A wild painted wolf, lean, spotted, electric with nervous energy, trots alongside a honey badger, not chasing it, not circling it, moving with it, shoulder to shoulder, almost companionably, through the golden grass. The honey badger doesn't bolt, the dog doesn't snap. They move together, as if this is simply what they do, as if this is simply what they are. That footage sat on a hard drive for months before anyone could agree on what they were looking at, because what they were looking at broke almost every rule in the book. If you've never watched a painted wolf hunt, you don't yet understand what it means to witness one of nature's most perfectly tuned machines. These animals, also called African wild dogs, Cape hunting dogs, or by their scientific name, Lycaon pictus, meaning painted wolf, operate at a level of cooperative sophistication that makes most other predators look clumsy and solitary by comparison. Their success rate on hunts can top 80%. Lions manage about 30%. Leopards hover even lower. The painted wolf is, pound for pound and strategy for strategy, the most effective large predator on the African continent. And yet here was one of them, or several of them by all appearances, treating a honey badger, one of the most notoriously belligerent, fearless, and frankly difficult animals alive, not as prey, not as a competitor, but as something very close to a packmate. This is a story about what happened when the rules broke down, when instinct bent, when the boundaries between species blurred in ways that science is still struggling to explain. And if this is the kind of story that makes you want to see more of the natural world laid bare in all its strangeness and complexity, then do yourself a favor and subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here, and there are many more where it came from. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the pack itself. The pack in question ranges across a broad stretch of semi-arid savanna in southern Africa, in a region where Mopani scrub gives way to open grassland, where seasonal river carve temporary veins through the baked earth, and where the distance between waterholes measures in hours of walking rather than minutes. It is not an easy landscape. It is not meant to be. The animals that have made lives here have done so through a combination of behavioral flexibility, physical endurance, and, in the case of the painted wolf, something that looks very much like social intelligence. The pack numbered 11 adults at the time the story begins, along with a litter of 8 pups that had emerged from the den approximately 6 weeks earlier. The alpha female, a broad-shouldered, scarred individual the researchers tracking this pack had named Kessie, after observing her single-handedly chase off a young leopard from a kill, had led this pack through 3 successful breeding seasons. Her partner, the alpha male, was a slightly smaller but extraordinarily fast animal the team called Duma. Together they had held the pack's hierarchy with a combination of authority and what can only be described as affection. Painted wolves are not cold, dominance by force creatures. Their social bonds are tactile, vocal, and constant. They greet each other with frenzied enthusiasm. They share food without violence. They care for injured packmates over days and weeks. They babysit each other's pups. It is this social architecture, this deeply embedded cultural tendency toward cooperation and inclusion, that may help explain what happened next. The honey badger was first recorded on the pack's camera trap network in early autumn. The cameras had been set along game trails and near kill sites to monitor the pack's movements and hunting behavior. In the footage, the badger appears alone, moving with that characteristic purposeful low-slung swagger, nosing along a trail that the dogs use regularly. At this point, there is no interaction. The badger crosses the frame. The dogs, recorded on the same trail 3 hours later, pause. Several of them nose the ground where the badger passed. Their body language is curious, alert, but not predatory. Now, honey badgers and painted wolves have a complicated history in the African bush. They are not natural allies. Honey badgers are famous, genuinely, internationally famous, for being willing to pick fights they have no business picking. They have been documented harassing lions. They escape from fortified enclosures. They survive snake venom that would kill animals 10 times their size. They are the apex of stubbornness in a continent not short on stubborn animals. For a painted wolf, a honey badger is rarely worth the effort. They are small enough that killing one provides little nutritional reward, and aggressive enough that the attempt often ends with injuries that no pack can afford. The usual relationship between the two species is one of mutual, slightly grudging avoidance, which makes what happened next all the more astonishing. 3 days after the first camera trap footage, researchers following the pack by vehicle at distance observed something that made them stop the car and sit in silence. The pack, 7 of the 11 adults plus 4 of the older pups, was moving through an area of thicker scrub at the edge of their territory, and moving with them, embedded in the loose cluster of dogs, was the honey badger. Not following behind, not being herded, moving with them. Trotting in the same direction, at roughly the same pace, maintaining a distance of perhaps 2 to 3 meters from the nearest dog, but making no attempt to increase that distance and no attempt to leave. The researchers watched for 40 minutes. In that time, the dogs rested twice. The badger rested when they rested. The dogs moved off. The badger moved with them. When a young male dog, one of the more boisterous juveniles, swung too close to the badger, with what appeared to be exploratory intent, Kessie cut across the group and inserted herself between them, not aggressively, almost quietly, but deliberately. They called the badger Kivuli. The name means shadow in Swahili. It felt right. To understand why this is so remarkable, you need to understand how tightly a painted wolf pack defines its social world. These are not loosely affiliated animals. A pack is a closed community. It has to be. The demands of cooperative hunting, the precise, wordless coordination of a pursuit that can last for kilometers, where every animal knows its role and executes it without hesitation, require a social trust that takes time to build. New animals are not simply absorbed into a pack. Other dogs, attempting to join a group from outside, typically face intense investigation, harassment, and often rejection. The social chemistry of a painted wolf pack is finely tuned, and disruption of that chemistry can mean the difference between a successful hunt and a failed one, between enough food for the pups and not enough. And yet here was Kivuli, accepted, or at least tolerated in a way that looked, from every observable angle, like acceptance. The question that immediately presents itself is the most fundamental one in animal behavior. Why? What could possibly motivate a painted wolf pack to extend its social circle to include an animal of a different species, a notably difficult and dangerous animal at that, with no clear benefit to themselves? The researchers began by looking for a simple explanation. Perhaps Kivuli was injured, temporarily unable to fend for itself, and the dog's tolerance was simply the absence of aggression rather than active inclusion. But Kivuli did not appear injured. The badger moved freely, foraged independently during periods when the pack rested, and on one occasion was observed successfully excavating a rodent burrow, a feat requiring both physical strength and coordination, while several dogs watched from a few meters away. Perhaps, the researchers speculated, there was a learned benefit at play. Honey badgers are extraordinary foragers. Their sense of smell is exceptional. They are masters of finding food sources, insect colonies, reptile dens, small mammal burrows, that larger animals move past without noticing. Could the dogs have come to understand, over repeated encounters with this particular badger, that following it led to supplementary food sources? There is some evidence for this kind of cross-species foraging association in other parts of the animal kingdom. Certain birds follow army ants not to eat the ants, but to catch the insects fleeing from them. Grouper fish have been documented signaling to moray eels to flush prey from crevices. Could Kivuli be functioning, from the pack's perspective, as an unwitting provider of small food parcels? It is a compelling hypothesis. And the camera trap footage does show, on at least 2 occasions, that after Kivuli successfully excavated a burrow, dogs moved in to investigate and, in one case, to snap up a lizard that had bolted from the disturbance. But this felt like too thin an explanation for the depth of what was being observed. Dogs are not patient animals. They don't build long-term strategies around small supplementary calories when their primary hunting method is already among the most efficient in the world. There had to be more. What the researchers began to notice, slowly and then all at once, was something about the badger's behavior specifically around the pups. The pups at this stage were mobile, energetic, and dangerously curious. This is the period in a painted wolf pack's year when the adults must maintain an almost constant vigilance, because the pups are old enough to explore, but young enough to have poor threat assessment. They chase things they shouldn't. They wander too close to the perimeter of the pack's range, where rival packs or large predators might be encountered. Keeping pups alive during this window requires enormous collective effort, and in a pack of 11, with food requirements pressing hard, there are times when fewer adults than ideal remain at the den site. On multiple occasions recorded on camera trap, Kivuli was observed near the pup group during these partial supervision windows. What the footage shows is not what you might expect. The badger does not ignore the pups. It does not tolerate them neutrally. In several sequences, Kivuli actively oriented toward pups that had drifted toward the den's perimeter, positioning itself between them and the open ground beyond. Whether this is intentional is impossible to say with certainty. Whether a honey badger can form any kind of protective motivation toward animals of another species is a question that behavioral science is not yet equipped to answer cleanly. But the effect was observable. The pups consistently turned back from the perimeter when Kivuli moved to intercept, and the adult dogs in the footage can be seen, rather than responding with alarm to the badger's proximity to the pups, continuing their own resting or grooming behaviors, apparently unperturbed. This is the detail that made the researchers stop and recalibrate everything. Because if the adults were comfortable with Kivuli near the pups, that was not tolerance, that was trust. And trust, among painted wolves, is not given lightly or accidentally. To appreciate what Kivuli had apparently earned, you need to sit with a pack through a full day and watch how they manage their world. The morning begins before first light. In the cool dark before dawn, the pack begins to stir, with a ritual of greeting so intense it looks more like a rugby scrum than a social exchange. Bodies press together, tails lash. High-pitched whines and yelps cascade across the group. Each animal seeks contact with every other, a rolling, ecstatic reaffirmation of the bonds that will carry them through the day. It is not optional, it is not casual. It is the daily rebuilding of the social contract. Then they hunt. Watching a painted wolf hunt is an experience that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it looks like chaos. A streaming cluster of spotted bodies, all movement and noise, flowing across the landscape behind a panicking impala or kudu. But watch longer, and the structure emerges. The alpha pair drives from the rear and sides, managing the direction of the chase. Flankers angle ahead to cut off escape routes. Younger, faster animals cycle to the front when the leader tires, taking over the pursuit without breaking stride or signal. The exhausted lead animal drops back, recovers its breath while running, and moves back to the front when it can. It is a relay race, and a tactical encirclement, and a feat of endurance all at once, and it operates almost entirely without visible communication. The kill, when it comes, is fast. Painted wolves do not play with their food. They do not torment. They bring down what they are chasing with a collective efficiency that is, in its way, merciful. What happens after is equally telling. The pups, if they have accompanied the hunt's final stages, are allowed to eat first. Injured or aged adults who could not run are fed by others who regurgitate portions of the kill. The sharing is not reluctant. It is structurally enforced by the pack's social norms, and animals that attempt to monopolize are gently but persistently displaced. This is the world that Kivuli had somehow negotiated entry into. Not fully. Let's be clear about that. Kivuli did not participate in hunts. The badger did not engage in greeting ceremonies with the dogs. There was no moment of social fusion in the way you might see between two dogs that have grown up together. What had developed was something more subtle, and perhaps more interesting. A parallel existence within overlapping space, a kind of companionable coexistence that had, over time, acquired the texture of something more than accident. The researchers documented the association across a period of 7 months. In that time, Kivuli was recorded on camera traps with the pack on 43 separate occasions. Direct observation added at least a dozen more verified sightings. The badger's home range, plotted from the camera trap data, overlapped almost completely with the pack's core territory. This was not a passing curiosity. This was a residency. There were moments of tension. Of course there were. 2 juvenile males in the pack, siblings, both about 18 months old at the time, and operating at the peak of their exploratory boundary testing phase, repeatedly attempted to engage Kivuli with the kind of bouncing, lateral approach body language that dogs use when investigating something they're not sure about. On most occasions, Kivuli ignored them. The badger's capacity for selective inattention is extraordinary. When you are built like a small armored vehicle, and your skin is loose enough to allow you to twist and bite anything that grabs you from behind, the calculus of what merits your attention is very different from most animals. The juvenile dogs were not worth Kivuli's concern, and the badger's relaxed dismissal of their approaches seemed, over time, to communicate something to them. They eventually stopped initiating. On 2 occasions, however, the approaches escalated to the point of contact. In the first instance, one of the juveniles placed its paw on the badger's back. A dominant posture, almost certainly not intended as an attack, but experienced by the badger as one. Kivuli spun with startling speed, produced a noise that can only be described as a sound not of this earth, and the juvenile bolted backward 6 meters in a single movement. No injury was sustained by either party, but the dog did not approach Kivuli that way again. The second instance was more complex. It occurred during a period of high stress for the pack, a period when a neighboring pack had made a territorial incursion, and Kessie and Duma were managing the resulting tension with unusual intensity. The atmosphere in the pack was electric with anxiety. In this state, one of the juveniles made a more serious move on Kivuli, snapping rather than pawing. Kivuli retaliated immediately and with force, and for approximately 30 seconds there was a genuinely alarming confrontation between the badger and 2 juvenile dogs. Then Kessie arrived. What Kessie did was not a separation in the way a human referee separates fighters. It was more like a presence. She moved into the space between the badger and the juveniles, not driving any of them away, but occupying the contested ground with a kind of absolute calm authority that seemed to reset the temperature of the encounter. The juveniles peeled away. Kivuli turned its back, sniffed the ground, and moved off. Kessie watched both parties and then sat down. It is the kind of behavior that, when described in writing, sounds almost too deliberate to be real, but it is what the camera captured. Whatever Kessie understood about the situation, her response treated Kivuli as a member of the social landscape worth protecting. Not as a threat, not as an outsider, as something the pack was responsible for managing around. This is not a minor point. This is, in fact, the heart of the story. There is a long history, in the study of animal behavior, of observations like this one being explained away. We have a tendency, understandable, rooted in scientific caution, but sometimes overcorrected, to resist attributing complex social motivations to animals. If a painted wolf tolerates a honey badger, we look first for a mechanical explanation, a conditioned response, an associative reward. Something we can account for without invoking the uncomfortable word that hovers over accounts like this one. But the data on painted wolf cognition and social intelligence has been accumulating for decades, and it is increasingly difficult to describe what these animals do without words that imply understanding. They have been shown to adjust their hunting strategies based on the abilities of injured packmates. They have been shown to modify group decisions, including decisions about when to initiate a hunt, in response to the apparent desires of individual members, registered through sneezing as a voting mechanism. There are credible, peer-reviewed accounts of painted wolf packs delaying a move from a kill site because a specific low-ranking member had not yet finished eating, with the group waiting and then moving off together. These are not the behaviors of animals operating purely on reflex and reward. These are the behaviors of animals that have some model of their social world, some sense of who is in it, what they contribute, and what they are owed. Against that background, Kessie's management of the situation with Kivuli looks less like a quirk and more like a policy. The months rolled forward. The pups grew. They grew quickly in the way that painted wolf pups do, the fat, round-bellied, enormous-eared chaos of early puppyhood gradually giving way to the lean, long-legged, alert animals they would become. Their ears, disproportionately vast in infancy, slowly came to suit their widening heads. Their spots clarified. Their individual personalities became distinct. And through all of this, Kivuli remained a presence on the edge of the pack's daily life. What changed, in the later months, was the nature of the pup's relationship with the badger, where the adult dogs had absorbed Kivuli's presence with varying degrees of equanimity. Kessie and Duma largely relaxed, some of the younger adults curious but restrained, the 2 juvenile males initially problematic. The pups had no learned framework for how to respond. They had grown up with Kivuli as part of their social environment. The badger was simply there, in the way that certain trees or certain rocks are simply there, familiar and unfrightening. And so the pups approached Kivuli in the way that pups approach everything, with incautious, irrepressible, deeply unwise curiosity. The footage of this is extraordinary. A pup, 7 months old, still with the slightly goofy physicality of the adolescent period, walks directly up to Kivuli and touches its nose to the badger's flank. The badger turns its head and looks at the pup. There is a pause that lasts perhaps 3 seconds and feels much longer. Then Kivuli turns away and continues sniffing the ground. The pup sniffs Kivuli's tail. Kivuli moves 2 steps forward. The pup follows. Kivuli turns and looks again. The pup sits down. This goes on for 6 minutes. It is the most mundane wildlife footage you could imagine, and simultaneously one of the most remarkable, because what it documents is not the dramatic flash of interspecies conflict, or even the more famous interspecies bond stories that involve rescues and dramatic moments. What it documents is the quiet, undramatic reality of two animals that have decided, or drifted into, a version of coexistence so complete that it has acquired the texture of the ordinary. Other pups followed the first one's lead. Within weeks, multiple members of the litter were comfortable approaching Kivuli, circling the badger, occasionally being swatted at with a low-energy warning that sent them tumbling back with exaggerated alarm before they gathered themselves and edged forward again. The badger's tolerance for pup behavior was notably higher than its tolerance for adult dog behavior. It is impossible to know whether this represents some recognition on Kivuli's part, some reading of the pups as non-threatening in a way that the larger adults are not, or simply the fact that a pup's approach carries no real force and so registers below the threshold of concern for an animal of the badger's capabilities. But it produced an outcome that nobody who has spent time studying either of these species would have predicted. By month 7, at least 3 of the pups were regularly resting within touching distance of Kivuli. Not cuddled up, not entangled, but within the zone that, for any wild animal, is the zone of intimacy, the zone where you do not allow predators, the zone where you do not allow strangers. Kivuli had become for these pups neither. The question of what benefit Kivuli derived from the association is, in some ways, harder to answer than the question of what the pack derived, because the clearest benefits appear to flow toward the dogs, the small supplementary feeding opportunities, the pup supervision effect. The possible role of a territorial marker, a honey badger's musk and presence, is not something any predator wants to walk through carelessly, and a territory scented by both a painted wolf pack and a honey badger sends a complicated message to potential intruders. But what did the badger get? Honey badgers are, under normal circumstances, solitary. They are not animals that seek company. Their famous aggression is partly a function of this solitude, an animal that has no group to fall back on, no kin to rally to its defense, must be capable of deterring threats on its own terms, which requires the kind of hair-trigger ferocity that honey badgers have turned into legend. They are self-sufficient by both biology and strategy. And yet here was Kivuli, voluntarily, persistently, choosing to spend the majority of its time within the social and spatial framework of an 11-member predator pack. There are a few possibilities. The most obvious is protection. A honey badger in the company of a painted wolf pack moves through a territory that is actively patrolled, defended, and kept clear of certain rival predators. Leopards, which are significant honey badger predators, give painted wolf territories wide berth. Lions are more complicated, but lions too avoid direct confrontation with a cohesive, mobile pack of painted wolves where possible. For a solitary badger navigating the same landscape independently, these threats are ever present. Inside the pack's territory, with the pack's presence as a kind of ambient alarm system and deterrent, Kivuli operated in a lower-risk environment than would otherwise be available. There is also the question of the secondary feeding opportunities. Painted wolves leave scraps. They are not clean feeders in the way that some predators are. They are fast and competitive eaters, and a kill site after a pack has fed is still a site with accessible calories. A badger that follows in the wake of a successful hunt gains access to protein it didn't have to work for. And then there is the possibility that resists easy categorization. The possibility that Kivuli, an animal whose intelligence is almost certainly underestimated by science, simply because it is difficult to study, recognized something in the social structure of the pack, recognized warmth, recognized safety in a sense that goes beyond pure predator avoidance, recognized belonging. We cannot know that. We cannot prove it. But we can note that Kivuli, for 7 documented months, chose to be where the pack was, chose it repeatedly, against a background of occasional conflict and no shortage of alternatives. The territory was large, the badger was mobile, Kivuli could have gone anywhere. Kivuli stayed. The story does not end cleanly, because wildlife stories almost never do. The pack denned again in the following season. Kessie produced a new litter, 6 pups this time, slightly smaller on average than the previous year's cohort, likely a reflection of a leaner hunting season during the pregnancy. The territory held. Duma remained a constant, his extraordinary pace undimmed, his relationship with Kessie as close and apparently affectionate as ever. The two juvenile males who had been Kivuli's most persistent antagonists had matured into their adult roles within the hierarchy. Their exploratory pushiness settled into something more purposeful. And Kivuli? The badger continued to appear on camera traps, continued to move through the pack's core territory. The new litter of pups went through their own process of discovering, with the particular chaos of the young, that there was a strange, low-slung, armored animal in their world that was neither food, nor threat, nor kin, and yet was somehow present in all the ways that mattered. The story's most recent chapter, at the time the footage was last reviewed, had Kivuli present at a den site with 3 adult dogs on a late afternoon, all of them resting in the shade of a mopane thicket, the new pups moving between them, with the energy only puppies have. The badger lay slightly apart from the dogs, as always. But the distance had shortened. Not dramatically, not by Hollywood standards, by perhaps half a meter over 7 months of coexistence. Half a meter, in the social geography of wild animals, is not nothing. Half a meter is earned. What does a story like this tell us, in the end? What does it tell us that we did not already know, or suspected but could not confirm, about the animals sharing this planet with us? It tells us that the categories we draw, the tidy taxonomic and behavioral boxes we use to make sense of the animal world, are always approximations. They are useful approximations. They have served science well, but they are built on averages and patterns, and the natural world is not a place that respects averages when it finds a more interesting solution. It tells us that social intelligence, wherever it evolves to sufficient depth, may arrive at similar conclusions regardless of the species in which it lives. The painted wolf, shaped by millions of years of selection pressure, toward cooperation, toward the management of complex social bonds, toward a form of trust-based collective action that has no equivalent among large African predators, arrived at a set of social capacities that could, under the right circumstances, recognize value in an unlikely partner. It tells us that honey badgers, those irascible, indomitable, magnificently stubborn animals, are more complex than their reputation suggests. That reputation is built on aggression, and the aggression is real, and it is spectacular. But a creature capable of aggression is also, by definition, capable of choice. Kivuli chose, again and again, to stay. And perhaps most of all, it tells us that the natural world continues to surprise us, not occasionally, not in edge cases, but regularly, persistently, every time we watch long enough and carefully enough, and with enough willingness to sit with something strange and not immediately explain it away. The painted wolf is already one of Africa's most endangered predators. There are fewer than 7,000 of them left across the continent. They have lost territory to human expansion, pups to disease, adults to snares and road traffic, and the slow, inexorable shrinking of the wilderness they need to function. A painted wolf pack requires a vast range. It needs space to run its hunts, space to move without encountering its own boundaries every few days, space to be what it is, which is something that does not survive well in fragments. Protecting painted wolves means protecting landscape at a scale that is difficult to justify to governments weighing up economic priorities. And it means community engagement in areas where subsistence farmers have legitimate grievances about painted wolves taking livestock. It is not a simple conservation problem. It rarely is. But stories like Kivuli's matter in this context. Not because a honey badger and a painted wolf pack becoming companions will change land policy or halt snare poaching, but because the best argument for protecting any animal is the argument that it is more interesting, more complex, more capable of surprising us than we gave it credit for, that it does things we haven't fully understood yet, that cutting it from the world is not just a loss of biomass, but a loss of possibility. A loss of futures that haven't been filmed yet, associations that haven't been documented yet, relationships between species that we haven't been patient enough or lucky enough to witness. Kivuli and the pack are that argument made visible. The mopane trees throw long shadows in the late afternoon light. The pups are wrestling with the focused absurdity of their age, falling over themselves, picking themselves up, launching themselves at siblings who are not paying attention. The adult dogs move through their evening routines with the easy competence of animals that know exactly who they are and what they are for. Kessie sits near the den entrance, alert, watching the perimeter, carrying the weight of the pack the way alpha females carry it. Not dramatically, not with display, but with a constant, quiet vigilance that never fully relaxes. And a small, low, barrel-shaped animal with a silver back and a black belly picks its way through the edge of the group. pauses, sniffs the air, turns its blunt, ancient-looking head in the direction of the pups. Stays. The camera rolls, the light falls. 7,000 painted wolves on a continent. One honey badger, one story that contains multitudes. This is what the wild looks like when it is left to find its own solutions. This is what happens in the spaces between the rules we write about it. This is why it matters that those spaces exist. And this is why we keep watching.